I'm really pleased to be presenting the staff from the End Youth Homelessness Project, who've done the fantastic study working with care experienced young people about their experiences of homelessness. So I'm going to hand over now to Sharon Lovell, the CEO of NIAS, who's going to introduce the session. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Alison, and warm welcome everybody. Prahanda. And I would really like to start by thanking everyone who's joined us this afternoon. We have had an overwhelming response with representation from the statutory and voluntary sector and Welsh Government. And I would particularly like to welcome the Deputy Minister, Julie Morgan, and the young people who are joining with us today. As Alison says, my name is Sharon Lovell and I'm the Chief Executive of NIAS Cymru. NIAS Cymru being a provider of advocacy services for children and young people in care. And I can see Jackie Murphy is also with us, who's another advocacy provider. Lovely to see you, Jackie. So I was approached to chair the End Youth Homelessness Group for care experienced young people by Hugh. And when I met the group, I was very clear that we were going to aim high and let's be ambitious to ensure we really do end youth homelessness for children and young people within the care system. The End Youth Homelessness Group for Care Experienced Young People has been in place now for about 18 months, and they're a dynamic group of individuals, both from the statutory voluntary sector, representation from the Children's Commissioner's Office, from Welsh Government, and it has been a real collaboration between health and social care housing. And I just want to pass on my sincere thanks to everybody who is part of that group, because it's hugely dynamic. And this piece of research has really formed part of our action plan within the End Youth Homelessness for Care Experienced Group. No young person who is in care should end up having a pavement for pillows. No young person should be vulnerably housed with nowhere to turn. And no young person should fall through the cracks and end up homeless, especially those young people in our care system in Wales. We have a duty to safeguard and protect these young people. Housing is a fundamental human right. Now more than ever, it's time to act. We are in challenging times. We are all tired of living in COVID. Yet if we are tired, what must it be like as a care leaver who is homeless right now or is vulnerably housed? The research we will be launching today was co-produced by young people who became peer researchers. I would like to sincerely thank the young people for sharing their experiences. I know often young people in care are asked to share their stories over and over, and it's not easy. And I want to reassure the young people who are with us today, we are listening, we will act. Welsh Government have pledged to end youth homelessness by 2027. Every day a homeless young person is on the streets is one day too long. The End Youth Homelessness Group are committed to eradicating youth homelessness. This research we will hear later provides clear recommendations for change. We need to examine our systems so that no young person falls through the cracks. My question today is simple. What can you do in your position right now to ensure we end youth homelessness for care experienced young people? We are all corporate parents. We have the solutions together. We can end youth homelessness together. The Deputy Minister who is with us today has kindly offered to respond to any questions we may have, and we know that her time is obviously very precious and is able to be with us until 2. So if people do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat as Alison described. And I'm going to ask Gemma now from Llamai with with Charlie, who's a peer researcher, to talk us through some of the work. Gemma has been instrumental in the facilitation and authoring this research along with Hugh. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gemma. Thank you.
And I'm the Policy and Research Officer at End Youth Homelessness Cymru. And I'm here with Charlie Barry today, one of our peer researchers who helped us put together the report, Don't Let Me Fall Through the Cracks, Care Experience in Youth Homelessness in Wales. Hi, Charlie. So I'm going to go through the methodology of the study. I'm going to do the science bit, and then Charlie and I are going to present some of the findings of the report. So the methodology, we used a participatory research design, and we involved care experienced young people throughout the study. We started off with a focus group where we determined themes and we looked at the main issues. We then worked with peer researchers across Wales. We worked with 6 peer researchers across North and South Wales to design the research themes again, to design interview questions. And it's great that Charlie's here with me today because she was really helpful when we were putting together the interview questions. And she was quite firm about what I couldn't ask and what I could ask. And she made the questions more kind generally and was very helpful with that. So of the participants, we interviewed 27 young people, again, across Wales. They were from 10 different local authorities across Wales. They were aged between 17 and 24. Most of them had become homeless since the introduction of the Barnardo's Care Leavers pathway. We knew that the policy was in place, the procedures were in place, but we needed to get youth voice. And I hope we've done that well to understand where the system was failing and where care experienced young people were still becoming homeless. So the report is based on the experiences of care experienced young people and their voice, and we just really wanted to get that across. And the peer researchers have been absolutely amazing. They've been phenomenal at every stage of the research, and it's so fantastic to be here with Charlie today to present the report. We just really need to know why some care experienced young people consistently fall through the cracks and become homeless based. We know their needs. They have well understood needs. The research has been saying the same thing for decades, and hopefully out of this report we can create some changes. So we'll present the report findings now, if I put my teeth back in. Okay. So why do young people become homeless? So this section I felt really strongly about putting something together here. Of all 27 young people I spoke to, they all felt like the homelessness was their fault, that they'd done something wrong. They didn't get that systems had let them down, and you know, it had always been rooted in poverty. I think every homeless experience was rooted in poverty, and things had happened over money, or there wasn't enough affordable housing, and they said it was their fault. And I was just really keen to let them know it wasn't their fault, and that's what this section of the report is about. And Charlie's going to tell us more, really. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks. The study shows that young people are not to blame when it comes to being homeless. Homelessness has been caused by system failures within social services, health, housing and other areas that were described in the interviews we conducted. All these system failures have contributed to care experienced young people being introduced to homelessness. Other than the system failures that are mentioned, young people have also said within interviews that being discharged from prison and or a mental health unit has been the reason that they've fallen into homelessness. The common theme between young people that we interviewed was that they experienced a relationship breakdown. They explained that when this occurred, they would tend to blame themselves. A breakdown within their relationship would cause a young person to lose the local connections that they once had. The rules that then surround the young person being eligible for a place to stay become a lot difficult without these connections. This then led to young people that we had spoken to being introduced to some of the worst cases of homelessness, which included living on the streets or sleeping on a floor space. What needs to be understood is that young people who are care experienced will more than likely have local connections in more than one area. They need to be able to acquire housing where they have support network to help them.
Thank you. Okay, so experiences of the care system. So the young person on the slide, he described just not being in control, not knowing where he was going to be going next. And that was really a common theme of the young people we spoke to. They spoke of frequent placement moves, not being able to put down roots, not being able to build relationships. Even within social services, there was a high turnover of staff. They felt that their PAs and social workers were good people. They really liked them. They just felt like that they had a high caseload and they weren't worthy of attention in their own right. And basically all these placement moves, all this high staff turnover made it really difficult for them to build relationships. And that was really the biggest theme of that. Also the paperwork. So young people felt that they got re-traumatized all the time because they kept having to repeat their stories. They kept having to repeat the traumatic experience they've got to. And one young person said, why do I have to keep repeating this? It is in a file. It is in a file in front of you. They were repeating their traumatic stories when literally the person in front of them had their file with everything written down in, and that's what they didn't like. Also the risk assessment, they felt like they'd been judged unfairly by a risk assessment, and this risk assessment had followed them into housing. So they said that this person, this social worker that saw them infrequently and changed often, put something on a piece of paper about them that didn't reflect who they were as a person. And they thought the risk assessment should be, maybe if you do even need that, should be more balanced and should have more about their personality, because people are making decisions about where they live on that risk assessment, and that's not always fair. So really, I think the major finding of this is stable relationships are key, consistency is key, keeping in place the staff as much as you can is key, not moving them around so much, keeping in the same area, being able to build relationships, stay in the same school. I think that would have made a really big difference for the young people we spoke to. Okay, and that really leads on to that is early independence, isolation and loneliness. We found all these were linked. So the quote on the slide is from Alice, and she's now age 22, or she was when she spoke to us. So she wasn't ready to move on from her hostel when she was aged just 18. She had a 24-year-old social worker telling her she was the age she needed to move out. When she spoke to a 24-year-old social worker, she was still living at home with her mother. And that's kind of the problem you've got here, is society's moved on. Now, the average age of leaving home in the UK is 25, but we expect care experienced young people to leave home when they're just age 17 or 18. And you know, that's really setting them up to fail. How many 18-year-olds do you know that could live independently with, you know, young people earn lower wages, there's less affordable housing. Really, society is not set up for young people to live independently when they're aged 18 anymore. Young people are staying in training and education longer. So the young people we spoke to felt support stopped or decreased significantly when they were aged 18. One young person was sofa surfing and she had to refer herself to a hostel while she was at the sixth form. So she was doing great, doing all this stuff and studying her A-levels, and she had to sort out her own homelessness herself, and her PA had actually gone on maternity leave. Yeah, and others felt just like there was nothing there for them anymore once they turned 18. So I think what we're saying here is young people need individualized responses. They need to transition from care when they're ready and not at some preset age. Yeah, and that's that. Also, next is mental health. Now, Charlie's going to tell you a bit more about mental health in a minute, but I just wanted to say young people really spoke freely and openly about their mental health. Charlie was very clear the questions we could ask about mental health when we designed the study. So we asked them if it was okay to talk about their mental health. And we said, you know, if you do want to talk about it, we don't want to know about any conditions, any issues. We just need to know what have your experiences been like getting help for your mental health, and whether your mental health's got worse when you were homeless. And Charlie's going to tell us more about mental health now.
Out of the 27 young people who participated, 5 of them spoke about how losing a loved one contributed to them becoming homeless, as if they didn't have already enough changes to deal with. The young people who had endured losing a significant loved one all expressed that they had all experienced mental health difficulties and all felt that in no way at all that they had received the help and support that they needed to help process this. There wasn't a question about whether or not they experienced any bereavement within the interview we conducted, and if they were, there may have been a higher number of young people who may have had the same experiences. There definitely needs to be more support offered and available to young people who have endured losing a loved one to be able to prevent them from becoming homeless. In terms of mental health services provided, many young people felt that they had gotten lost within the transfer from child and adolescent mental health services to adult mental health services. This may be a resulting issue of them becoming homeless and not having any fixed address or having to move and change their address a few or more times, resulting in being unable to be contacted to receive the right help and support that they need. Also, it may not always be the case of being lost in transition from CAMS to adult mental health services. As a care experienced young individual myself, I found it quite difficult accessing mental health teams on my own. I was lucky enough to have a strong support network around me who would ask if I needed help and support with my mental health and help me access all the services available to me. Many young people are not fortunate to have the support teams around them to help them prevent situations such as becoming homelessness. Mental health difficulties come in many forms such as depression, anxiety, personality disorder, etc. So it can be incredibly difficult asking for help in the first place. This is why it is incredibly important to make everyone aware of the services available to them, whether it be through telling them at LAC meetings or advertisements that they can even access if they are within a different area. Also, this is why support networks are so important. This ensures that no young people fall through the cracks and get lost. So to reiterate, care experienced young people need more support with help to access mental health services.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so this was another finding of the report, is just the standard of temporary accommodation or emergency accommodation available to young people. I've really got to start by saying we're not talking about specialist supported accommodation for young people. Young people reminisced about their time in supported housing accommodation in specialist projects for young people. When we're talking about emergency and temporary accommodation, we're talking about floor space, we're talking about pods, night shelters, that kind of stuff, and not specialist supported housing projects. So the quote on the slide is from Nick, who's age 20 now. He stayed at the night shelter when he was 16 with much older people with substance misuse issues. He just, you know, wanted to put a complaint in, really, that it's not acceptable for a 16-year-old care experienced young person to be sleeping in a night shelter on floor space with older homeless people with you know, entrenched issues. And he's actually spent some time in prison since, and he said staying in prison was better, and a much better standard of accommodation than sleeping in floor space. And he wanted to put a complaint in that 16-year-olds should never sleep on floor space. So this was a difficult one for me with the research, temporary accommodation. I asked people, and I spoke to 27 people, as I mentioned earlier. 13 of them were still homeless and not always in the best situation, and not always staying in the most appropriate accommodation. And what they wanted for accommodation was quite bare, was quite minimal. And, you know, I wanted big ideas, idealistic policy officer, and they wanted things like a locker where they could put their bag in the day and things like that. And we kind of thought we could do better and we could be more aspirational for them. So what we did instead was we got a focus group together of young people who had experienced homeless, so they had been homeless, and we asked them to come up with some minimum standards of temporary accommodation. So here are the minimum standards of temporary accommodation that Charlie and I are going to take you through now. So the young people called them their golden rules of temporary accommodation. So they'd all stayed in it, but they were all settled and they were all in a supported housing project for young people when they came up with a list, so they could be a bit more aspirational. Even so, the list is still shocking. So the first thing they asked for was no damp, which seems pretty basic to me. The second one was security. So they wanted a lock on their door. They wanted somewhere they could secure their stuff. The third one was privacy. Again, that seems so basic for me. They wanted a lock on their door. The fourth one is access to a private shower and toilet. Sometimes they were sharing a shower and toilet, and that's not always ideal. The fifth thing was hygiene products. So they wanted hairbrushes, they wanted sanitary products, a toothbrush, some toothpaste, just so, you know, they could make themselves feel a bit more human again. One young person was saying she hadn't had a hairbrush the whole time she was homeless, and just a hairbrush would have made such a difference when she moved into temporary accommodation. The other thing they wanted was connectivity. So this isn't just about internet. Internet is important, obviously, but this was about being connected to the local community, being on a bus route, being able to access shops. So this focus group took place in North Wales, and a lot of the young people had been housed in places that were kind of the middle of nowhere, or had infrequent bus routes, so they couldn't get to shops, they couldn't get to places easily. And when you're on a very limited income, you know, buying a pot noodle in the corner shop and that kind of thing can be very expensive. And then I'm going to hand over to Charlie to say the other bits of the list.
They said they'd like a kettle and a microwave. Having the ability to make a hot drink was very important. Who doesn't like a cup of tea? Easy access. Young people wanted accommodation to be on a bus route, that they have more opportunities to visit friends, families, find work, etc. And they also wanted a key to the front door and no curfew. Number 9 was pretty standard, a window. Can't understand why you wouldn't have a window, personally. Number 10, first aid. Ideally, they wanted a first aider on site, and if that wasn't possible, a first aid box, because to be fair, anything can happen. Caring staff who they could talk to. Sometimes people just needed someone to talk to about anything, like you would with a parent, and obviously a lot of these young people haven't experienced that, so it would be lovely to have someone they can chat to about whatever. And last one was, if they shared, it wouldn't want to be shared with older people, especially if there's harmful substance use issues, because that can be terrifying if you're young and you've just had to move out and the first place you go is people who are scary. So
yeah, young people spoke of it's hard not to get involved as well.
yeah,
if you're put in that environment, whether, not all young people obviously, but you could get involved easily, whether it's in selling or using. It's
especially if you're struggling already with life.
Yeah.
Into it. So.
Yeah, I just think we need to look after our young people better and our care experienced young people better. Okay, so a COVID-19 update. You will probably have noticed we haven't mentioned the coronavirus. So our last interviews were held in March 2020, so it was a couple of weeks before lockdown. It was only mentioned in one interview. A young person just said in the last interview in March, I can't get to see the doctor for my mental health. Everything's about this virus and I need support with my mental health. So yeah, it was only mentioned in one interview. Since then, there have been some welcome changes to temporary accommodation in Wales. So Welsh Government in June released their phase 2 of their plan of what they're doing about temporary accommodation. The report says it's no longer acceptable for people to be staying on floor space in pods. That's not just young people, that's all young people. But the report also mentions that there needs to be specific provisions, especially for young people, such as supported housing projects. So we've got somewhere safe that young people can go where they're not with older people, they're not sleeping on floor space. So that's a really welcome change. Yeah, and that's the research really. And now Hugh is going to take you through some of the recommendations of this research, and Charlie and I and Hope will be joining you on a panel, and you can ask us any questions about the research. Thank you so much for listening to us today. Thank you.
Hopefully enough, my notes won't show up when I'm doing this, so I'm looking at 2 computers as I go. So Gemma, drop me a text if if there's a lag or if I forget to change a screen or something. So yeah, I'm Hugh Russell. I'm the project manager for End Youth Homelessness Cymru, which is a coalition approach to tackling and ultimately ending youth homelessness, led by Clamai. A little bit about the recommendations. These are based around the experiences you've just heard and the demands of the young people we spoke to and worked with. Wherever possible, they are direct reflections of those demands. A good example is minimum standards for temporary accommodation. That's something young people specifically asked us for. Otherwise, they represent interpretations by our team based on literature review, based on working with a wonderful group of experts, interpretations based on that other knowledge to what the young people were telling us was wrong, so that we could look at specific policies which were impeding those young people or were making their situations worse. So an example of that is recommendation 8 in the report, which relates to UK government's benefit laws. There are recommendations in here for government at all levels, at UK level, Welsh Government and local authorities. So on to the first one. Our first recommendation isn't for anything new. Instead, we're asking Welsh Government to revisit a framework released in 2016, the Care Leavers Accommodation and Support Framework for Wales, which was developed by Bernardo's alongside a range of other stakeholders, including care leavers. We believe that the work done on that framework was hugely valuable, and where it's not being used, it might offer much of what has been missed in the experiences of the homeless young people we spoke to, who described inconsistency or lack of joined up thinking occasionally between different services. So we're calling here for Welsh Government to work with local authorities to review how that framework's used. If it's not something that local authorities work with, why not? Do they have insufficient resources to be able to consult the framework? Does it need updating? There were 2 2018 studies that looked at how it was used in Wales. Bill Rowland's paper, which focused on one local authority and found that the framework was underused, there was a lack of awareness of it, or the staff were unclear as to whether it was intended for their use. And Tamsin Sterling, who looked at provision for care leavers across Wales, found a similar level of inconsistent use with regard to the framework. She described it as well used in some local authorities and little used in others. So moving on. Recommendation 2. A multi-agency review should be undertaken anytime a care experienced young person presents to a local authority as homeless or at risk of homelessness. I've given a quote there from one young person, which I think illustrates some of this. When we talk about systems failure or systems breakdown, Nick's story here is a perfect example of different systems with different priorities, perhaps failing to link up, ultimately leaving Nick homeless. So this is one of our key recommendations, and of all the points presented here today, could have the biggest impact on addressing some of the systems issues which mean that young people don't get the support they need at the right time. What we're asking for here is for all 22 local authorities to establish a protocol which is triggered when a care experienced young person presents to them as homeless or at risk of homelessness. A multi-agency review should be called as quickly as possible, which should be chaired by a director of children's services or someone with equivalent position at the local authority. It should take a serious case review style approach and seek to establish what happened to that young person to mean that they ended up in that position, involving relevant agencies who've had an impact on that young person's life to that point. This would allow for a thorough examination of the interactions between services and identify the gaps through which the young person's fallen. Having a senior figure leading the process means that the findings of the review could lead to the sort of changes that will mean that over time, the number of young people ending up in this situation diminishes. We know that whenever a young person ends up in this situation, the social workers consider this a significant failure. We certainly aren't calling for some kind of dragging over the coals process focused on any one individual, but for a review of the wider circumstances and systems that led to this point, and from that, for internal changes to be made so that it doesn't happen again in future. So I've bundled together recommendations 3, 4, and 5 here. I'll whiz through them quickly. We would like Welsh Government to explore the feasibility of a right to return to care policy. We'd like Welsh Government and local authorities to review local connection rules and practice with regard to care experienced young people. And we'd like local authority housing options teams to always proactively seek to establish whether a young person is care experienced upon presentation as at risk of homelessness. There's a quote there with some made up place names from an 18-year-old whose life was set back really as she saw it by local connection rules and their application by a local authority. So on the first point, the right to return to care, we believe care experienced young people need to be able to make mistakes, still be supported by the system, including those who provided them with care and guidance in the past to avoid the traumatic experience of homelessness. Young people should be given the option to return to their care placement or another support option such as supported lodgings if they need it. Other young people are able to return to and receive ongoing support from their parents in the event of, say, a relationship breakdown. So we're calling for parity for care experienced young people. We do recognise that foster placements are often filled as soon as they become empty. But we're asking Welsh Government to look at what options we can provide to level that playing field for care experienced young people and get as close to a right to return to care as possible. I should add, I mentioned supported lodgings. Can we make sure our mics are muted, please? I should add that, End Youth Homelessness Cymru is facilitating a group which is coming together next week to examine what needs to be done to improve the availability of supported lodgings placements in Wales. So if you'd like to get involved in that conversation, drop me a line, please. On the next point on local connection, young people told us that they declined local connection to areas they'd been placed in care in and felt settled. I've included that quote, as I say. Care experienced young people should be able to have the area they've been placed in considered as an additional local connection. Their choice should lie with the young person. This additional flexibility would enable young people to live close to support networks and reduce the loneliness, which is a really clear theme in our findings described throughout the paper, which young people told us often led to them becoming homeless. As such, we're asking for a review of both local connection regulations and their implementation. And finally, on this slide, we're asking that local authority teams, housing options teams, always proactively seek to establish whether a young person is care experienced upon presentation as homeless. This may change what they're entitled to. It may sound obvious, and it doubtless happens in most cases, but we've been told on a number of occasions that homeless young people missed out on support because upon presentation, the local authority didn't have access to the required information. Young people told us that they didn't think to explain the situation themselves, in one case because of the mental health crisis they were dealing with. But presenting as homeless is a stressful situation, and it shouldn't be on a young person's shoulders in that situation to explain that they've been in care. Moving on, Welsh Government should review the capacity and levels of staff turnover in social services, providing additional investment as necessary. This is quite a broad recommendation, but it reflects a repeated theme throughout the findings, whereby young people shared a perception that their PAs and social workers were burdened with high caseloads. One young person commented that they considered their workers to be nice people, but perceived them to be very busy as they've got thousands of cases, reinforcing a sense that they were one among many rather than worthy of attention in their own right. Young people told us in some cases they lacked confidence that their social workers had the capacity to support them. Young people told us that these disruptive, inconsistent experiences in care can have a lasting impact, leaving them feeling unsupported and ultimately more likely to experience the later tenancy failures that often lead to homelessness. To address this, a review of the size and complexity of social services caseloads is needed, with the input of young people taken into account. Further investment in social services to allow for smaller caseloads could help to minimise the disruptive experiences in care, which young people have suggested were contributory to their homelessness. And there's a quote there from a 19-year-old. I haven't had the same social worker most of my life. I don't remember most of their names because there's a different one every time they come and see you. Moving on, there was a clear call from young people throughout the interviews for support to prepare them for the financial burdens that come with independent living. Those we spoke to identified budgeting as the area they needed most support with. Many felt underprepared for independent living, which contributed to the failures of their tenancies. Every local authority as a corporate parent should ensure that their young people have the opportunity to develop these skills while in care. On a positive note, we note in the report there is good practice noted throughout the report, which would be great to see consistently applied. The quality of advice and information provision being developed across a number of local authorities at the moment via Children in Wales and Voices from Care Cymru's Getting Ready project looks really promising. We hope that an independent evaluation of this project, along with the other youth homelessness innovation funded projects, can be carried out over the coming months, so that we can be certain that it's meeting the needs of young people, and it can then be rolled out further across Wales. Moving on, I'm not going to dwell on this one as I think I'm over time already. We've worked with the Children's Commissioner's Office throughout the development of this report, and we'll be presenting a short paper to her on this particular issue around benefits, share with her counterpart in England, to see if we can get some movement from UK government on it. Okay, recommendations 9 and 10. This, as you've heard, mental health and bereavement were key themes throughout the paper. Pluck some quotes from the report. They just say, if it gets worse, come back. It's worse now. It's so stupid. That's from a 17-year-old. 4 of the 27 care experienced young people we interviewed revealed that they'd attempted suicide. They described feeling depressed, anxious, and in pain. 20-year-old told us it's way too complicated. You go to one person, then through to another person. You got to wait like months to find out where you are. All the time, your mental health is being affected. 23-year-old told us, I'm still on a waiting list at the moment. Been on it for 2 years. Being transferred from CAMS to adult mental health services was a shambles. We know mental health support for young people is under scrutiny at the moment. Both the Welsh Youth Parliament and the Senate's Children, Young People and Education Committee recently released new reports about the difficulty of accessing these services. We know the demands on these services are rising, that it's often a complicated process to access help. However, the young people we spoke with for this report needed more support with accessing those services than was available to them from their corporate parents. So in tandem with the changes needed to health services themselves, we'd like to see local authorities committing to ensuring that young people in their care get all the help they need to access those health services, and to reviewing how that support is being provided now, particularly at points of transition. Again, we highlight good practice in the report. NIAS's NEWID project, for example, is designed to support care experienced young people with precisely that transition. There needs to be consistent provision of support like this across Wales. Moving on to bereavement, this was a theme that recurred more frequently than we'd anticipated. And in some cases, young people told us they'd felt unsupported to deal with the emotional toll that came with the loss of a parent or partner. In addition to the recommendation about support for transition between youth and adult mental health services, we'd like local authorities to consider the bereavement support that they make available to young people. The ability of care experienced young people to access bereavement support consistently and quickly when needed should be reviewed by all local authorities, and appropriate action, such as additional staff training on the effects of a bereavement and how to offer support, should be taken. Moving on to last set of recommendations. These relate to the temporary accommodation issues that Charlie and Gemma highlighted for us. There's 3 here. We're asking that Welsh Government commit to ensuring that no 16 or 17-year-old should be accommodated in unsupported temporary accommodation. 16 and 17-year-olds who present to a local authority as homeless, whether care experienced or otherwise, should be found appropriate supported accommodation, whether via supported housing project, foster placement, supported lodgings, or similar supported placement. If short-term accommodation is required to allow for assessments to be made and appropriate longer-term accommodation found, it must meet the minimum standards set out by young people in this report, with support provided and a timescale provided and stuck to for the young person to move on to settled accommodation. Welsh Government should deliver a commitment to strictly limit the length of time that any young person over the age of 17 should be expected to remain in temporary accommodation before being found settled housing, as has been done in Scotland. The term accepted there is 7 days. This fits with Welsh Government's current stated approach of rapid rehousing in settled accommodation. This settled accommodation might include youth-focused, shared supported accommodation or single-person accommodation with floating support as necessary, depending on the needs of the young person. Finally, Welsh Government should enforce new minimum standards of temporary accommodation. These should be agreed in consultation with young people and informed by the golden rules set out in this paper. We know Welsh Government is progressing towards rapid rehousing. We know that there's a commitment that floor space is no longer good enough. But for vulnerable children and young people who've grown up in care, we're asking for this government to move faster and to address these key points before the next Senate elections. Okay, that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for a really thorough overview of the 13 recommendations within this report. I think are all tangible, all achievable if we act faster and together. So thank you so much for providing that thorough overview. I'm now going to hand over to the CEO of Llamau and chair of the End Youth Homelessness Steering Group. And that's the wonderful Frances. So over to you, Fran.
Hi, everybody. Very, very good to be here. I think the report is absolutely fantastic, but you know what's going on and going through my mind right now? It's actually unrepeatable on a screen, but it starts with 4 and it ends with sake. Our recommendations are not new. Young people have been telling us about this for years. Going in my head, I'm like, it's their own fault. No, 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 no. The recommendations are reasonable and reflect what options are open to young people who are fortunate enough to live within families. So my question is, why aren't we listening and why hasn't there been action? And I don't just mean Welsh Government, because we're all responsible, every single one of us who works in this field. And corporate parents, they have no right to call themselves parents. And I think we need to be far more stringent and a little bit louder in saying you're doing a shit job and you're letting young people down. So I'm calling on every local authority to re-examine their practices urgently. It's almost more urgent now than ever because we know the pandemic means that young people are even more at risk. And I personally think it's a serious failing if, as a result, for example, of our recommendations for a multi-agency meeting led by a head or equivalent of Children's Services is not called every single time a care experienced young person presents at risk or being homeless. The response should be, we failed. What can we do about it? Let's get back together. We know the pandemic is causing a great deal of harm to young people. And I just hope that this fantastic report, which has been put together by the most important people, peer researchers with lived experience, we have to amplify their voices and we have to shout for this, for our recommendations, their recommendations to actually be heard, and call for serious and immediate improvements, such as the need for investment in youth mental health services. How can we have a new Deputy Minister for Mental Health and suicide and young people aren't in the brief? Again, you know, the word starts with 4 and it ends with sake. And I think we've got to be a little bit more stringent and vocal. End Youth Homelessness Cymru is an amazing coalition of people and organisations who want to make a difference. We started because we were so frightened and scared seeing young people being placed into unsuitable bed and breakfast accommodation. They were dumped there. They were left unsafe and unsupported. And I was really chuffed that we saw a huge drop in the numbers as a result of that campaign. But we started to get more and more concerned just before the pandemic because the numbers started to rise. And the fact is, those numbers are attributable almost directly to social services placements, corporate parents again. And I think we have to shout loudly and clearly. Young people have the right to good quality, supported, psychologically informed specialist accommodation whilst we sort out where's the best place, and listen to their voices and listen to their experiences, because if we listen to them, they'll tell us what's best for them. And frankly, a repeat of social workers saying the same thing, I'm different, I listen to you this time, is not what we need to hear. I think the other important thing is, it is an absolute fact, we will never end homelessness in Wales unless we end youth homelessness. What frustrates me is we know how to do this, and we simply cannot allow the pandemic to mean we fail yet another generation. 50% of people who are homeless had their first experience of homelessness before the age of 21. Early intervention, prevention services, rapid rehousing and specialist support are the absolute keys to ending youth homelessness. So part of me is saying, we know what we need to do, and no matter the pressure that Welsh Government and local authorities are facing, we owe it to the current generation of young people not to allow that to be an excuse. So I'll close now because I know we're running out of time, but I'd ask everyone to support End Youth Homelessness Cymru. It is a real coalition. It's not one organisation. It's about us all coming together, because that saying is, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And I think End Youth Homelessness Cymru and the wonderful people that are supporting it, and that fantastic care report shows that our voices can be amplified if we come together. So please visit our End Youth Homelessness Cymru website, contact us about working together, and let's get our voices behind to ensure these recommendations and this amazing report put together by the people that count are used as a step-by-step guide to improving the lives of so many wonderful, inspiring young people with so much potential. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Fran. You are quite right. We have to act now. We cannot delay our recommendations anymore. And you have my commitment as chair of the End Youth Homelessness Group for care experienced young people, and the many people who are representing of the sector, that we will continue to be on this journey. And this is the beginning, really, in terms of we have this fantastic report now to lobby, influence, to create the change that young people have so very much said loud and clear within the report. So thank you so much, Fran, for always being so supportive and such an advocate for young people in Wales. So this is an opportunity now for anybody to ask questions to the panel being Charlie, Hope and Hugh and Gemma. I'm mindful that we have 5 minutes left before we come to an end. We could have had all afternoon really and gone into breakout sessions, I'm beginning to think, and really start to explore what we could do and what power we have from our places to influence now these recommendations. But for now, if there are any questions that people would like to verbally ask Hugh, Gemma or Charlie, this is the opportunity within the next few minutes. I can see that there's been some real activity on the chat as well, which is fantastic. But if anyone did verbally want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand, that would be fantastic.